Ladies and gentlemen, it is a real pleasure to be here in Bogota and to be able to meet teachers and policymakers who are committed to improving children's lives. And in that vein, can I thank the Fundación Aprender a Quererte and the Impresarios por la Educación for making this conference possible. Thank you very much. Today I want to talk about the growing importance globally of cognitive science and the scientific evidence in education practice, in the design of the curriculum, and in education policy more generally. And I'll do so through the story of the education reforms we introduced in England between 2010 and 2023. I want to talk about the fundamental importance of those skills of reading and maths, and the key role that actively involved teachers played in developing our thinking as ministers and in the reforms implementation in England. The starting point for me were the OECD's PISA international surveys of the reading, maths and science attainment of 15-year-olds across what is now 79 countries, which were first published in the year 2000, when the UK came a respectable 4th, 7th and 8th in science, reading and maths. But as you can see, in the years immediately following, the UK was beginning to slide quite dramatically down the international league table. This also reflected what employers were saying, that school leavers' literacy skills were not good enough and their mathematics was diabolical. Universities were complaining that undergraduates were less well prepared for degree-level study than previous generations. To try to understand what was happening, I started visiting schools every Monday throughout my time as the shadow schools minister between 2005 and 2010. We were not in government at the time, we were in opposition, and as you know, we have a parliamentary system in Britain, and all our ministers have to be members of parliament. And of course, this was long time before the first research-ed conference was started in 2013. And from my visits to those schools and discussions with teachers and principals, I came to the view that a particular ideology was the cause of our decline. I saw a lack of academic rigor, poor pupil behavior, and a weak curriculum, particularly in schools serving more disadvantaged communities. And I saw strange teaching methods that I didn't think were very effective. But when I tried to define what I meant by this particular ideology in a more scientific way, I struggled. But more of that in a moment. But in 2003, I met a former primary school principal, Ruth Miskin, who had just developed her own phonics-based reading scheme called Read Write Inc. And she introduced me to the intellectual battle between the whole language or 3 cueing approaches to the teaching of reading and the more effective systematic synthetic phonics approach. In the former method, children repeat high-frequency words, look, John, look, Janet, look, and children are encouraged to see the word as a whole and try to remember it without sounding it out. With phonics, as you know, children are taught the 44 sounds of the English alphabet and how to blend those sounds into words, k, a, t, cat. And the same principle applies in Spanish and other languages, including Arabic and so on. And Ruth explained to me that the multi-cueing approach to the teaching of reading, which was the method prescribed by the government of the day, was damaging children's ability to read. And this approach in England was also known as the searchlight model. So children were taught to identify a new word by looking at the context of the story. What could this word be, given what we've just read so far? In the context of the grammar, in the context of even the picture, to identify the word. I was also introduced to this study. This was a research study carried out in a small borough in Scotland, in the north of the United Kingdom, called the Clackmannanshire Study. And this was conducted by 2 academics from Hull University and from St Andrews University. 300 pupils in 3 groups. One group was taught using systematic synthetic phonics, and the other 2 groups were taught using mixed methods, similar to the approach then taken in England schools. After 16 weeks, the phonics group were reading and spelling 7 months ahead of their chronological age, and they were 8 to 9 months ahead of the other two groups in spelling and 7 months ahead of the other two groups in word reading. All 300 children were then taught using synthetic phonics, with the researchers following those pupils for 7 years. At the end of primary school, these children had a word reading age. This is 6 years later. These children had a word reading age of 3.5 years ahead of their actual age, and 1 year and 9 months ahead in spelling. A remarkable and very significant outcome that influenced what we were to do when we were in government. So fast forward to 2010, when we came into office after the May 2010 general election, and I was appointed as the schools minister and Michael Gove as education secretary. We changed the national curriculum to require teachers to use systematic synthetic phonics in the teaching of reading. We funded schools to buy phonics resources and training. We changed the teacher standards so that to qualify as a primary school teacher, you had to be able to teach children to read using systematic phonics. And we changed the inspection framework. We inspect our schools every 3 years, and we changed the framework of that inspection so the inspectors were required to listen to the weakest readers in the school as part of that inspection. And most importantly, we introduced a new evaluation, the phonics screening check. This is a test of 40 words. Each 6-year-old child, these are tests for 6-year-olds, so it's very controversial when we introduced it. Each 6-year-old child reads the 40 words one-to-one with their own teacher. The pass mark is 32 correctly read words out of 40, and if a child doesn't reach 32, then they're required to sit the check again the following year at the end of year 2. That ensures that no child slips through the net with their reading struggles unnoticed. Of the 40 words in the check, 20 are pseudo words designed to ensure that children can count out new words using phonics. These are not real words, these are made-up words, and there's a picture of a monster next to each word so that the child doesn't try and fit a word they know to the letters. The results, the test became compulsory in 2012, in June 2012, and in that year, 58% of children were able to read 32 words correctly out of 40, and then it rose to 69% the following year as schools started to really adopt phonics in the teaching, and then by 2019, just before COVID, it had reached 82%, and then of course it slipped after COVID, and now it's back up to 80-something percent last year. There's a 92% achievement rate if you include the results of the year 2 tests, but there's more to do. We should be achieving, in my view, 92% in year 1, or even 95%, and several hundred schools each year manage to get 100% of their children passing this test, and I would write to them to congratulate them when they did so. And it's working. Every school now in England is using phonics in the teaching of reading, even if some schools do so better than others. Gone is the multi-cueing. Gone is a searchlight model approach to teaching children to read, which essentially involves encouraging children to guess. And I don't think now you will find in primary schools in England any child that can't read. But as we seek to continually improve the teaching of phonics, we also need to promote reading practice, to increase children's speed of reading, and to encourage a habit and love of reading. And in 2017, before we go back to that, there we go. In 2017, I went to Australia to talk about phonics, and they did introduce a phonics screening check in Australia, and now it's in 6 different states in Australia as well. And we know that phonics is working because in the most recent PIRLS study, this is the Progress in International Reading Literacy, England came 4th in the world out of 43 countries that tested children of the same age, behind just Singapore, Hong Kong, and Russia. And now there's a chart, so we're 4th in the world, and the Times newspaper, when these results came out, said that England's readers are the best in the West. But hopefully there'll be other countries beating us in the West in the future. So that's the phonics screening check that was introduced in South Australia, and that's the results of the South Australian results. But going back to that original slide that I showed at the beginning, we were worried about the maths. If you look, we were 8th in the year 2000, and we were sliding. So we were 28th in 2009. We jumped up a little bit to 26th, but these were not good results. England's strategy for teaching maths was not to teach the formal written methods of mathematical procedure that Nick Gibb talked about. All the teaching in primary schools about maths was trying to convey the concepts of conceptual understanding of mathematics, and the methods they were using were not the efficient written algorithms that children need to know, but there were other methods designed to sort of instill an understanding of the mathematics, which actually didn't work. So what we did, we looked around to see who was at the top of PISA in maths, and it was Hong Kong, South Korea, Singapore, all of which used a more structured approach to the teaching of those algorithms and of the teaching of maths than we were using in England at the time. So as part of our curriculum review, we took the 2007 primary Singapore curriculum. As a minister, I just wanted to photocopy this and make that the law, but I had to consult people and so on and all that business. But it did form the basis of the curriculum. And from my visits to schools, I used to talk to children in grade 5 and grade 6, and I used to ask them their tables. Pretty cheeky of me, really, as a visitor to the school. But it was clear that there were some hands that went up, but not every hand went up, particularly when we came to the tricky ones, 11/11s and so on. So I realized that not enough children knew their tables by heart. There were too many different methods were being used to teach these things in schools. And those written methods I talked about, they were actually mental maths approaches rather than the formal algorithms that used to be taught. So, as well as changing the national curriculum to incorporate the Singapore curriculum, we also required children to learn their tables to 12 times 12 by the end of year 9. That's the Singapore curriculum. And we introduced another test. This is called the multiplication tables check. This is for children aged 9 at the end of year 4. It's a computer-based test, 25 questions. They have 6 seconds to answer each question. This test took several years to develop. Governments are notoriously bad at computer-based anything, so we wanted to get it absolutely right so it didn't go wrong, and it didn't go wrong. It was rolled out, and it was compulsory in 2022. And in that first year, 27% of 9-year-olds in England got 100% of those questions right, and the average score was 19.8 out of 25. I was pretty pleased by those results. But each year it went up. So by 2024, it reached 34%, and last year, 37% achieved full marks, and the average score is now 21 correct answers out of 25. So I'm pretty confident now that children really do know their tables. Sometimes children slip when they're doing their finger on the computer-based check. And you can see in this slide, and that's the new national curriculum. That's all very good. This is the details of the national curriculum. You can see how we insisted that the traditional algorithms were being taught. These had all disappeared from primary schools in England. They were not using any of these methods. So this is the PISA table. You see how it's dominated. This is PISA math. This is the maths ability of 15-year-olds. You can see Singapore dominates the table. Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, and so on. England at the bottom, there we were, 27th. England, rather than the United Kingdom, 27th. And there we are now, 11th. We've gone from 27th in maths in 2009 to 11th in maths in 2022. And I'd like to think we can go further higher. I don't think we'll ever reach the Singapore East Asian approaches because the children there are made to work several hours after school, and that's not something that English children want to do, nor should we make them do it. But I'm pretty sure we can learn from how they teach maths in those countries. Just going back to my struggles with understanding what this ideology was that was doing so much damage to England's schools. In 2007, the government had introduced what's called a competence-based curriculum in England. It's sometimes called a skills-based curriculum. And what this does, it places a greater emphasis on high-level intellectual skills rather than setting out the knowledge, the concepts, and the principles that students need to be taught. And our schools had already been moving in this direction prior to 2007. A competence-based curriculum sets high-level objectives such as creating responsible citizens or successful learners, replacing detailed subject knowledge. But for England's pupils, it was a disaster. And there's we'll come back to that in a second. It was a complete disaster. Children just didn't know things. They didn't know enough science, they didn't know enough history. And due to that lack of knowledge, they didn't then develop the intellectual skills that was the purpose. Just going back, this is the, you'll know from your geography, if you've had a knowledge-rich curriculum, that the United Kingdom is made up of 4 nations, Northern Ireland, Scotland, England, and Wales. England is the red line. This is the PISA scores. PISA breaks it down into the different nations of the United Kingdom. And you can see Scotland and Wales did not introduce our reforms. Was only responsible for England. I was a UK government minister, but education was a devolved matter to the different nations. They had their own education ministers in those jurisdictions. They did not follow our reform program. In fact, they doubled down and had an even more progressive or ideological approach to the curriculum. And you can see how Scotland has gone to 32nd in maths in PISA, and Wales has fallen to 34th, whereas England's gone up to 11th. I'm not saying that because, hey, we're really great, but to say that the methods we used are the methods that deliver the results that we want for our children. So this is what happens when you have a competence-based curriculum. This was a quiz conducted by an economics lecturer in Cardiff University in 2009. And he asked his undergraduates, 264 undergraduates over 3 years, some very, very basic history questions. And these are questions that all school leavers 20 years ago would know the answer to. Name one prime minister of Britain in the 19th century. Only 11% could do that. We have some very famous 19th century prime ministers, Disraeli, Gladstone, Robert Peel, and only 11% could name any one of those. Terrible. This is a real indictment. And he blamed it on the way we were teaching history through a competence-based curriculum. We were teaching the skills of how to be a historian, to think like a historian, to examine evidence, sources, and so on. But we weren't teaching the knowledge. So in 2005, we were still in opposition. I was still struggling as a policymaker to try and understand what this ideology was that was causing such damage to our education system in England. And my researcher said I should read this book by E.D. Hirsch called The Schools We Need and Why We Don't Have Them. And reading Hirsch, it was a revelation to me. It explained the whole notion of this ideology that had come to dominate English education and why it was so damaging to children, particularly to children from disadvantaged backgrounds. And he explained that this ideology had its origins at Teachers College, Columbia in New York in the 1920s. And their romanticist ideology, based on the philosophy of the 18th century philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, their belief that children could learn through self-discovery and through inquiry, their hostility to didactic, explicit teaching, their hostility to knowledge and exams. They believed that knowledge somehow corrupted children, imposing today's values and things on the children's creativity. By contrast, Hirsch explains that how knowledge builds on knowledge, and that if you believe in social justice and helping children from the most disadvantaged backgrounds, who come to school less knowledgeable than their more advantaged peers, you need to teach knowledge that children need. And he called this the Matthew effect. And for those that know the Gospel of St. Matthew, for to everyone who has will more be given, and he will have abundance. But from him who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And what Hirsch says is that those children who possess intellectual capital when they first arrive at school have the mental scaffolding and Velcro, he says, to catch hold of what is going on, and they can turn that new knowledge into still more mental Velcro to gain still more knowledge. But those children who arrive at school lacking the relevant experience and vocabulary, they fall further and further behind. And as all the previous speakers have said, if you want to close that gap, you absolutely need to teach knowledge. So reading Hirsch gave me the definition and explanation of this damaging ideology that I've been grappling with and seeking. So Hirsch explains it's based on the idea, he said, of inculcating formal skills, on the idea that inculcating formal skills is much more important than the transmission of knowledge. That's what this ideology said. The ideology said that knowledge is considered less desirable than more practical, all-purpose goals, such as higher-order thinking skills, self-esteem, metacognition, and critical thinking. Mere facts are seen to be just rote learning, something these ideologists condemn. But for Hirsch, these higher-order skills actually come from the acquisition of knowledge, rather than the other way around. And Hirsch writes in this book, he says, paradoxically, adequate attention to the transmission of broad general knowledge actually does lead to general intellectual skills. The paradox is quite stunning, he says. America's education system's emphasis on formal skills has resulted in students who are deficient in formal skills, whereas an emphasis on transmitting knowledge results in students who actually possess the skills that are sought by American educators, skills such as critical thinking and learning how to learn. Hirsch had a huge influence on me, and because I made everyone I meet read the book, it had influence on others, and I'm still waiting for my share of E.D. Hirsch's royalties. In fact, here's a picture of him. There he is. 97 years old in that picture. He's now 98 and still going strong. The other book I wanted to introduce you to, the academic, is Daniel Willingham in his book, Why Don't Students Like School? And Zach, this book is already in Spanish. We don't have to wait for it to come out. He explains that working memory can only hold or remember half a dozen pieces of new information. Thus, for any high-level intellectual activity that requires significantly more than 5 or 6 pieces of information, in other words, all high-level intellectual activity, you need to be able to draw on information stored in the long-term memory. As Willingham writes, and it's reflected in the other sessions we've had this morning, Willingham writes, working memory has limited space, so thinking becomes increasingly difficult as working memory gets crowded. And he goes on to write, research from cognitive science has shown that the sorts of skills teachers want for students, such as the ability to analyze and to think critically, require extensive factual knowledge. These skills are, Willingham says, intimately intertwined with factual knowledge that is stored in long-term memory. In other words, the evidence from cognitive science flatly contradicts received views in the education world that knowledge is less important than teaching skills such as critical thinking, problem solving, and creativity. What's now clear is that only by having knowledge in your long-term memory can you perform those high-level intellectual activities. And this evidence undermines the whole reason, the raison d'etre of the competence-based curriculum that was so widespread in England's schools and which had led to our decline in PISA. Which is why when we came into office in 2010, we removed the competence-based curriculum and we established a fundamental overhaul of both the primary and secondary curriculum, and we introduced a knowledge-rich curriculum from 2014 onwards. And there's a picture of Daniel Willingham, should you wish to see one. Now, the third book I wanted to introduce you to, this third person, is Daisy Christodoulou. And she wrote a book called 7 Myths About Education. It was published in 2014, and it had a profound impact on thousands and thousands of teachers in Britain. And for me, one of the key myths, one of these 7 myths that she explodes, is that you can teach children the intellectual skills of an expert, how to work scientifically, how to think like a historian, how to think like a geographer. And that was the basis of our curriculum. That's why we didn't teach enough knowledge, because we were teaching children sources and teaching children how to conduct the theory behind conducting experiments. Well, this is a myth, she says. And she makes the point, as Nidhi did earlier, she makes the point that those experts have spent 20 or 30 years acquiring the knowledge that gave them the skills of an expert. You cannot directly teach the skills of an expert to a novice, she argues. Teach them the knowledge of the discipline, and from that knowledge will come those skills. And she also makes the point that these intellectual skills are therefore domain-specific. Being a problem solver in maths doesn't make you a problem solver who can fix your car. You need to know about car mechanics to fix your car. But the belief is that these skills are transferable, and they are absolutely not. I haven't mentioned the Academies program, which effectively turned our in our local authority, our municipalities controlled state schools into autonomous charter schools. We took poorly performing schools and we turned them into charter schools with a sponsor and a supporter. We asked if good schools wanted to become academy and acquire the autonomy, and they were able to become academies. And now 83% of all our state high schools in England are academies, with the same autonomy as a charter school in the United States. And 43% of primary schools are also now academies. And that autonomy, free from the education ideology dominant in those municipalities, has liberated our teaching profession in England, freeing them to adopt what the evidence says works rather than what the education professors in Britain's education faculties and universities asserts works. Teachers in England are now writing and researching, and they established conferences such as Research Ed. Research Ed was first started in England in 2013 by a London teacher called Tom Bennett, and now, as we know, it's spreading around the world. And here we are, the first Research Ed conference in Colombia. Tens of teachers have podcasts in England, and there are over 1,200 teacher-written blogs about the curriculum and about teaching methods. Teachers in England have taken control of their profession, and they have been key to developing the intellectual case for our reforms in England. We also allowed and supported teachers to establish their own schools. So we had a population increase. We needed to create 1 million new school places between 2010 and the 2020s. And we passed a law preventing municipalities from opening any new schools. Any new school had to be a free school, established by either another school or by a group of teachers or parents. And we called those schools free schools. That's just the curriculum. Just flick through these. There we go. That's the national curriculum coming in. So I just want to just show you that. Yes. So we now have 650 free schools, and they dominate the top of the league tables. Almost all of these schools are free schools established by teachers who wanted to run their own show. And finally, I just wanted to talk again about the four nations. So it's made up of England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And those nations, as I said, have devolved administrations, and they have their own education policies. And Scotland and Wales, instead of following our reforms to deal with this ideology that was so damaging, they actually doubled down on it. And Scotland introduced what's called the curriculum for excellence, but it really isn't. So in effect, what we have in the United Kingdom is a natural randomized controlled trial. And here are the results of that controlled trial. You can see that, as I said before, Scotland has fallen from 30th place in maths and science in PISA, and Wales has fallen to 33rd in reading and maths, and 34th place in science. As you can see, there's one oddity, which is Scotland has risen in reading, despite not introducing phonics. But actually what happened in Scotland, they don't take part in PIRLS, but what has happened in Scotland is the biggest research took place in Scotland, in Clackmannanshire and in West Dunbartonshire. And my theory is that they've done well because they have learned from phonics because of those controlled trials that took place in their own country. So that's really the history of what happened with our reforms. And I think that any nation that is serious about raising its education standards can learn from our experience. And there are things we didn't do right. There are things, if I could go back, and I would do better. But now we know so much more about cognitive science. And when we were doing this, there were no books by Jacques Rochelle. There were no conferences like this. We had to base it on our own reading of people like Hirsch and Willingham and researchers like that. But we now have the proof that if you introduce these reforms in any nation, your education system will improve, and the life chances of millions of children will improve along with it. So thank you very much.